The sun dipped low, casting a golden haze over the quiet ripples of the lake. For Ethan, this tranquil sight was more than just a view from his cabin. It was his sanctuary, after a decade of service that had taken him to some of the most chaotic corners of the world. This small, family-owned property in the heart of rural Pennsylvania was the only place he felt a true sense of peace. The cabin, built by his great-grandfather, was a rustic testament to a simpler time, and the lake, a glistening oval of crystal-clear water, was the centerpiece of his family's legacy. He had spent the last 2 months meticulously restoring the old dock, mending the weathered wood, and preparing for a summer of quiet solitude. He wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, he was actively trying to escape it. But trouble, as he was about to discover, had a way of finding him, even in the most remote corners of the world. The first sign of the impending storm was a late-model black SUV that crunched to a halt on his gravel driveway. It was followed by a smaller, 4-door sedan. From the SUV stepped a woman who looked like she had just stepped out of a corporate boardroom. She had a severe bob haircut, an impeccably tailored business suit in a color that matched her scowl, and an air of unshakable authority. This, Ethan instinctively knew, was Brenda, the president of the community's homeowners association. She was flanked by 2 nervous-looking individuals carrying clipboards. The group moved with a purpose that felt entirely out of place on his property, their footsteps a jarring rhythm against the natural symphony of the evening. Mr. Ethan Carter. Brenda's voice was sharp, cutting through the peaceful evening air. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders and receiving immediate compliance. My name is Brenda, president of the Lakeshore Community Homeowners Association. Ethan, still holding a hammer, simply nodded. He'd seen her name on the welcome letter, a dense, multi-page document he had yet to read. He had also heard the whispers from a few friendly neighbors about her reputation as a stickler for rules, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer force of her presence. Brenda didn't wait for a reply. She marched straight to the edge of the lake, her eyes scanning his newly repaired dock as if it were a criminal offense. "This is a violation," she stated flatly, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the structure. "A clear violation of our community bylaws." Ethan's confusion quickly turned to irritation. "This is my property," he said calmly, his hand tightening around the hammer handle. "The lake has been in my family for generations. My grandfather built this dock." Brenda's mouth twisted into a tight, humorless line. "That is where you are mistaken, Mr. Carter. We had the property lines resurveyed last year. According to our official records and the updated survey, the lake is classified as a common-use recreational area for all HOA members. Your dock is an unauthorized encroachment on community property." The 2 people behind her shifted uncomfortably. Avoiding eye contact, they were merely her audience, a silent, intimidated support group for her tyrannical crusade. Brenda reached into her briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers, handing them to him as if they were a divine decree. "This is a formal notice of violation, along with a schedule of fines. You are to remove this structure within 30 days. If you fail to comply, the HOA will have it removed and bill you for all associated costs. You will also be subject to fines of $100 a day for every day it remains." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air, a surreal and insulting echo of a life he had left behind. He was being fined for his own property, for a dock his grandfather had built. The peaceful sanctuary he had been dreaming of was being threatened by a woman with a clipboard and a thirst for power. He took the papers but didn't look at them. He simply held them, his gaze locked with hers. The calm that had defined his evening was replaced by a quiet, simmering anger. "Brenda," he said, his voice low and even, a tone he hadn't used in years. "You don't have the authority to tell me what I can and can't do on my land. This lake is private property. It has been for over 100 years. Now, I suggest you and your associates get in your cars and leave my property before the sun goes down." Brenda's face flushed with a mixture of shock and rage. She wasn't used to being defied. "Don't you threaten me, Mr. Carter," she hissed, her voice rising in a squeak of frustration. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer, and you can expect that $100 fine to start tomorrow." She spun on her heel, her entourage scurrying to keep up as their vehicles disappeared down the gravel drive, leaving only a cloud of dust and the scent of burnt rubber. Ethan stood alone again. The sun had set, and the twilight gave the lake a somber, gray appearance. He looked down at the documents in his hand, the crisp paper a stark contrast to his own calloused hands. She had tried to claim his lake, the one place he had thought was safe. But what Brenda didn't know was that, while she had a team of lawyers and bylaws on her side, Ethan had something much more powerful, a legacy he was willing to fight for and a quiet resolve forged in battles far more serious than this. She had just made a huge mistake. The real fight had just begun. Brenda's departure left a profound silence, but it was anything but peaceful. It was the calm before a storm, a stillness charged with the electricity of an impending conflict. Ethan stood by the lakeside, the hum of his own anger a low thrum beneath the cicada's evening song. He had come here for serenity, but in just 15 minutes, his tranquil retreat had been violated by a force he had only ever encountered in caricatures on the internet. Brenda wasn't just a nuisance. She was a threat, a person who weaponized bureaucracy and used fear to enforce her will. The papers in his hand, the notice of violation and the schedule of fines, felt like a physical assault on his sanctuary. He crumbled them into a tight ball, his jaw clenching. He wouldn't let her bully him. The question, however, was how he would fight back. The next morning, Brenda's campaign began in earnest. The first sign was a series of small, official-looking signs that appeared around the edge of the lake, hammered into the ground with alarming speed. Each sign, bordered in the HOAS signature blue and white, read, "Lakeshore Community Property. No trespassing. No unauthorized structures." The message was clear. She was staking her claim, not just with words, but with physical markers. Ethan watched from his window as a younger man in an HOA uniform methodically placed the signs. He felt a surge of indignation, the feeling of his private property being publicly branded as a community space. He grabbed his hammer, the same one he had been using to repair the dock, and walked out to the nearest sign. The young man, spotting him, quickly scrambled back into his vehicle and sped away. Ethan pulled the sign from the ground, the wood splintering, and tossed it into a pile of brush. He would not allow these visual lies to stand on his land. The second wave of the attack came through his mailbox. Every day for the next week, he received a new, official-looking envelope from the Lakeshore Community Homeowners Association. They weren't just simple letters. They were meticulously crafted documents, each one a testament to Brenda's obsessive attention to detail. The first was a notice stating he had been fined $100 for unauthorized use of the lake. The next day brought another for failure to comply with the initial notice. The day after that, an additional fine for unsanctioned construction of his dock. The fines were piling up, not just in theory, but in the form of official-looking invoices with threats of liens against his property. She was building a paper fortress around her false claims, making it seem as though her authority was absolute and unquestionable. He read the letters, his eyes scanning the legalese and bureaucratic jargon. They were designed to intimidate, to overwhelm him with the sheer weight of their official tone. But what she didn't know was that Ethan had spent years studying the art of the indirect attack, of understanding an opponent's weaknesses before striking. He wasn't scared, he was calculating. Ethan didn't just have a past in service. He had a deep-seated appreciation for things that were solid, real, and undeniable. His career had taught him to rely on facts, not assumptions. He knew that for all her bluster, Brenda's entire campaign was built on a single piece of paper. The updated survey she claimed classified the lake as a common area. His grandfather, a man of meticulous record-keeping, had always told him to know the ground you stand on. This advice now resonated more deeply than ever. Ethan went to the attic, a place filled with the musty smell of history. Boxes upon boxes were stacked to the ceiling, filled with decades of family photos, letters, and documents. He was looking for something specific, something his grandfather had mentioned in passing years ago, the original deed to the property. It was a long shot, but it was the only piece of evidence that mattered. For days, he sifted through the boxes, the dust filling the air, each document a ghost of the past. He found bank statements from the 70s, handwritten tax returns from the 80s, and endless family photos. The search was slow, frustrating, and seemed to be leading nowhere. Brenda's harassment wasn't limited to paper. One afternoon, while Ethan was out, a small crew arrived and began painting a boundary line on the land right up to the water's edge. This was a clear act of defiance, a visual declaration that the lake was not his. Neighbors, who had until now stayed away, began to send him worried messages or give him sympathetic looks. Brenda was winning the public relations battle, framing him as the selfish newcomer who refused to share. But in his heart, Ethan knew the truth was on his side. He just needed to find the proof. The thought of confronting her again was exhausting, but he knew it was inevitable. The final piece of the puzzle, the key to his entire defense, had to be somewhere in this attic. It was a race against the clock. The HOA meeting Brenda had announced was just 2 weeks away, and she was building a compelling narrative against him. He just had to find that one piece of paper that could turn the tide. He had to find the truth buried in the past. He was about to give up for the day, his hands and clothes covered in dust, when he spotted it. Tucked behind a stack of old magazines was a small, worn leather binder. It was not labeled, but something about its age and weight felt significant. He opened it, and the smell of aged paper filled the air. Inside were his great-grandfather's meticulous records, handwritten notes on the construction of the cabin, and most importantly, a folded document with a beautiful cursive script at the top, the Carter family deed. He unfolded it carefully, his heart pounding in his chest. And there it was, a detailed map of the property. His eyes traced the boundary lines, which clearly encompassed the entire lake. Underneath, a handwritten clause dated 1965 stated, "The parcel of land known as the Carter homestead includes the entirety of Lake Serenity, which is considered private property and shall not be subject to any future community or association jurisdiction without explicit and written consent of the owner." He had found it, the truth, a piece of history that would not only expose Brenda's lies but also end her reign of terror. He didn't just have a legal right, he had an undeniable, historical claim. Brenda's biggest mistake wasn't harassing him, it was underestimating the lengths he would go to protect what was his. With the deed in his hands, he was ready for the next part of the battle. He knew exactly what he was going to do next, and he knew it would be a sweet victory. He would not just stop her, he would humiliate her in front of the entire community, and he would do it on her own turf. The community center's meeting hall was a sterile, unforgiving space, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare over the rows of plastic chairs. Every seat was filled, a testament to the community's interest in the escalating drama between Brenda, the HOA president, and the new homeowner, Ethan. The air was thick with tension, a palpable mix of curiosity and discomfort. Brenda sat at the front of the room, perched behind a table like a queen on her throne. She wore a confident, almost smug expression, her gaze sweeping over the audience with a look that dared anyone to question her authority. She had spent the last 2 weeks rallying support, sending out emails, and painting Gethin as an antisocial troublemaker. This meeting, in her mind, was not a debate. It was her coronation. Brenda stood up, a polished presentation glowing on a screen behind her. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice resonating with an air of practiced professionalism. "As you know, we're here to discuss a crucial community asset, our lake." She clicked a slide, revealing a map of the neighborhood. For decades, this lake has been underutilized. It's a beautiful resource, but because its ownership was unclear, we couldn't properly maintain or develop it for everyone's enjoyment. She paused, letting the word unclear hang in the air, a subtle jab at Ethan. However, after a new, comprehensive survey, we have corrected this ambiguity. The lake, in its entirety, is a common use area. She clicked again, and the map showed the lake shaded in blue, a symbol of its new, public status. Unfortunately, one new member has chosen to disregard our community bylaws and has built an unauthorized structure, refusing to remove it despite multiple official notices. She gestured toward a large, grainy photo of Ethan's dock on the screen, a visible sign of her hostility. Brenda continued her monologue, her voice dripping with self-righteousness. This isn't about one man's property. This is about shared resources. It's about fairness and community. We cannot allow one person to hold a beautiful natural resource hostage. We are a community, and we must act as one. She finished her speech to a smattering of polite applause. She was confident, assured of her victory. The crowd's quiet demeanor was, to her, a sign of consensus. Therefore, she declared, her eyes glinting with triumph, I propose a vote to formally reclassify Lake Serenity as the permanent recreational common area and to authorize the immediate removal of all unauthorized structures. She raised her hand. All in favor. Several hands went up hesitantly. Brenda smiled, already counting her victory. It was in that moment, just as she was about to call for a vote to finalize her triumph, that a voice cut through the air. Excuse me, Brenda. All eyes turned to the back of the room. Ethan stood up from his chair, his presence a calm, commanding force that immediately drew attention away from the smug HOA president. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't angry. He was simply composed. Brenda's smile faltered. Ethan, she said, her voice laced with annoyance, this is not the time for debate. We are in the middle of a vote. I understand, Ethan replied, his voice calm, but I believe I have some information that might change the vote. Without waiting for her permission, he began walking towards the front of the room, a worn, leather binder clutched in his hand. Brenda was flustered. She had planned for him to be angry, to yell, to argue. She hadn't planned for this quiet, confident demeanor. She stammered, this is highly irregular. But Ethan was already at the front table. Before you vote, he said, addressing the room, not just Brenda. I want to thank Brenda for her thorough explanation of the HOA bylaws and the new survey. It's clear she's done her research. Brenda's face softened, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. Was he giving up? Was this a backhanded compliment? Her expression quickly turned back to one of superiority, but Ethan wasn't finished. However, he continued, it seems there was one document that was overlooked in her research. He opened the leather binder, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. He carefully pulled out a folded document and laid it flat on the table for everyone to see. This, Ethan said, his voice now carrying a powerful weight, is the original deed to my property, dated 1965. It was signed by my great-grandfather, a legal document that predates this HOA by a significant margin. He pointed a steady finger to a clause near the bottom, and it states, in very clear terms, that the parcel of land known as the Carter Homestead includes the entirety of Lake Serenity, and that the lake is and shall remain private property and shall not be subject to any future community or association jurisdiction without explicit and written consent of the owner. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Faces turned to each other in stunned disbelief. A murmur of whispers erupted as neighbors leaned in to read the ancient document. Brenda's face went from confident red to a pale, ghostly white. Her meticulously built fortress of lies had just crumbled. This document, Ethan added, his voice low and firm, is legally binding. It means the lake is my private property, not a common area. Your survey is irrelevant, and your bylaws have no jurisdiction here. He then reached into his other pocket and pulled out a clean, crisp envelope. And just in case there was any further confusion, he said, placing it on the table, this is a cease and desist letter from my lawyer, addressed to the HOA President. It outlines the harassment, the baseless fines, and the illegal trespass on my property. It states that any further attempts to claim my land will result in legal action. The silence in the room was deafening. Brenda was speechless, her carefully constructed authority shattered in a matter of minutes. The victorious smile was gone, replaced by a look of utter, total defeat. The community was no longer looking at Ethan as a troublemaker. They were looking at Brenda, and a storm of disapproval was brewing in their eyes. The silence that followed Ethan's words was heavier than any argument could ever be. It was the silence of a truth so absolute, it shattered a carefully constructed lie into 1,000 pieces. Brenda, who had always commanded the room with her sharp voice and even sharper opinions, was now just a woman with a pale, vacant expression. Her eyes darted from the old deed to the cease and desist letter, as if trying to comprehend a language she had never seen before. The power she had so fiercely wielded just moments ago had evaporated completely. The entire audience, once so captivated by her one-sided narrative, now looked at her with a new mix of pity and disgust. A man in the front row, a board member named Frank, was the first to speak. Brenda, he said, his voice quiet but firm, you told us you confirmed the survey with the county. Did you not? Brenda's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Another woman on the board, Maria, shook her head in disbelief. We've been harassing this man, issuing fines, and threatening legal action, all based on a report you provided. She looked at the other board members, their faces grim. The community was no longer a passive audience. They were an angry mob, not with pitchforks, but with disappointed gazes that cut deeper than any physical threat. The whispers started again, but this time they were not about Ethan, they were about Brenda's abuse of power, her lies, and her malicious campaign. Brenda finally found her voice, but it was a pathetic, defensive whine. This document ... it's old, it could be fake. The new survey is the legal standard. Ethan calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. It's been digitally archived, authenticated by a lawyer, and verified with the county's historical records. It's real, Brenda. You just didn't bother to look. The finality in his words was like a gavel striking down her last argument. Seeing their leader's desperate attempt at a cover-up, the rest of the HOA board quickly moved to distance themselves. Frank stood up and addressed the room. The board was not aware of this document. We were operating under the information Brenda provided. He looked at her with a withering glare. Given this egregious abuse of power, I move that we vote for a full recall of President Brenda from her position, effective immediately. The motion was seconded within seconds. A unanimous show of hands, including those of her former supporters, cemented her defeat. Brenda stood for a moment, the queen who had just been dethroned. The community meeting, her stage for victory, had become a public execution of her authority. She began to slowly gather her papers, her hands trembling. No one offered to help. No one spoke to her. She walked past the rows of chairs, the silence a heavy blanket of shame. When she reached the door, she glanced back at Ethan, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and broken pride. He didn't gloat, he just held her gaze, a silent reminder that she had lost. The community watched as she walked out in the night, her reign of terror over, her legacy a cautionary tale of a HOAKaren who messed with the wrong guy. The moment Brenda disappeared through the doors, the hall filled with a wave of murmurs, but the tension had vanished. It was replaced by a palpable sense of collective relief and embarrassment. The very people who had looked at Ethan with suspicion now approached him with sincere apologies. Frank, the board member who had called for the recall, was the first to extend his hand. Ethan, on behalf of the entire board, I want to formally apologize. Brenda's actions were reprehensible, and we were misled by her fabricated reports. She acted with no authority from us. Other neighbors followed. each one expressing their regret for not seeing the truth sooner. They spoke of Brenda's controlling nature and how she had a history of intimidating residents into following her absurd rules. Ethan, with a quiet strength, simply accepted their apologies and said there were no hard feelings. He had fought for justice, not for grudges. The board, to make amends, held a brief, impromptu vote right there and then. They officially to rescind all fines and notices issued to Ethan and promised to have all of Brenda's unauthorized community property signs removed by the next day. The entire hall cheered. Ethan was no longer the troublesome new guy. He was a hero who had exposed a bully and brought transparency to the community. He thanked them all and quietly slipped away, leaving the board to deal with the messy paperwork of Brenda's downfall. His victory wasn't in their applause, it was in the knowledge that his home was safe. The next morning, the sun rose over Lake Serenity, just as it always had. The air was crisp, and the water was a perfect sheet of glass. A small, familiar smile touched Ethan's lips as he sat on his repaired dock, a fishing line cast into the clear water. The signs Brenda had put up were gone, replaced by the peaceful, undisturbed landscape. The past week of stress and conflict felt like a distant memory, a chaotic interruption to the life he had sought. He had faced his fight and won, not with threats or deception, but with quiet resolve and a piece of paper. The real victory was not about Brenda's public humiliation or the board's apology. It was about this moment, the quiet lapping of the water against the shore, the gentle tug on his line, and the undeniable feeling of peace. He had protected his family's legacy and his own sanctuary. Brenda had tried to claim his lake and found out the hard way that a man defending his home is the last person you ever want to cross. As he watched the sun climb higher, he knew his work was done. His lakeside sanctuary was truly his again.